I'm delighted to welcome you to this. We don't have a lot of time, so we're going to get right into it, and I'm going to spare you lengthy introductions because I think our people are fairly well known on this panel. I will say that we have today, I am Shankar Singham, I'm the chairman of the Legatum Institute Special Trade Commission. We have, starting from my far left, Luis de la Calle, who is Mexico's chief trade negotiator for NAFTA, and is a member of our Special Trade Commission. Alan Oxley, who was Australia's trade negotiator, GATT Council chairman, founder of the Cairns, and a member of our commission. And then to my immediate left, Crawford Faulkner, who was New Zealand's chief trade negotiator and chairman of the WTO Agriculture Committee and another member of our Special Trade Commission. Unfortunately, Grant Aldonis is not well today, so our US negotiator, is not able to be with us. And Julian Braithwaite, our ambassador to the WTO, has been unfortunately unable to speak because of the election and the further process. For fear that someone will ask him something. But we were with him previously, and he is very much committed. Everyone working on this process. I'm going to start. There's a lot that's been said about the WTO. Things like crashing out of WTO rules and so forth. And what we wanted to do with this panel, we have at Legatum put together, and I will be talking about it in the trade keynote later on today, a blueprint for UK trade policy. These publications are available outside. And what we seek to do, and what I'll explain in the keynote, is that the UK has an independent trade policy, the potential for an independent trade policy going forward that includes a unilateral pillar, what we can do by ourselves, a bilateral pillar, what we can do with other countries in terms of trade agreements, and what we can do with plurilaterally with a group of like-minded countries. The final pillar is what we do multilaterally, which is the WTO piece of this. And the WTO is the foundation on which everything is built. So, far from crashing out on WTO rules, we are all bound by WTO rules. We will always be bound by WTO rules. And they provide the foundation on which all of our trade strategy is built. Now, what we have to do in the next 2 years is basically retake our position at the WTO table. We are WTO members already. We have schedules that are discoverable. We will be in the process in the next years of finding out what those schedules exactly are. And so that is the process we're embarked on. But the WTO process is not just about the rectification of the UK's position within the WTO. It's also about the advocacy that the UK provide in the WTO to the rest of the WTO community. So I'm going to start with Luis de la Calle, who is the former NAFTA negotiator from Mexico. In this, Luis, in this WTO process that we're embarked on, 150 countries, the UK is going to have figure out what is its position. What is the expectation of the rest of the WTO membership? Mexico relatively recently joined the GATT, WTO historical term, but has been a huge participant in WTO processes, has negotiated perhaps trade agreements or other. And what is the WTO membership response to the UK's position?
Well, good morning to all, and thank you, Shankar, for the invitation, for the opportunity to share with you some thoughts. I'm really surprised that if in any other country you had a panel on WTO rectification, you'll have an empty room. WTO, what is it? And rectification, even more. I think you're living through a fascinating time in the UK because it's an opportunity to rethink what you want. From my point of view, the European participation in the EU was extremely important as a force for free trade process. And that important responsibility now is going to be much larger because, I mean, the world will expect the UK to be a force for free trade worldwide. And the only place where you can do that effectively is WTO. All the things you're going to do, as Shankar said, be them unilaterally, in the sense that you might want to open up your economy, deregulate, be more participant, a larger participant in the world economy, things that, that you do non-strategically because you do it with everybody else. You might want to do bilateral agreements that you'll do strategically because you have to choose your partner, they'll be chosen by others. You might want to do it plurilaterally with a group of countries. And then you'll do it multilaterally in WTO. I mean, the fact that WTO is at the end of this presentation saying it's multilateral does not mean that it is the last option or the only option. Actually, it's the underlying framework, the platform that allows you to do everything else. Single market in the EU built upon WTO discipline. Your relationship with the EU, in the end, has to be consistent with Article 24 of GATT. So everything you will do will be a country like the UK, WTO consistent. And the role you'll play in WTO can be tremendously influential. I mean, you are the newcomer. That gives you an advantage because you can propose things that others do not dare to propose, have not dared to propose in the last 50 years or so. So you can come up with good ideas, new ideas as to how to better integrate the world. And the other pieces that you do in your trade policy, be them bilateral or plurilaterally, in my view, should all have as a common goal trying to foster multilateral trade open. The UK is already very open economy. Goods and services in investment matter. You function as a country based on the principle of non-discrimination. Well, that is exactly what WTO is. So for you to open up has no cost. I mean, not real cost to speak of, because you are already open. You have already paid the price of being an open economy. So your task now is to make sure that others open up. You develop in WTO is conducive for more open world trading system, where we can all benefit from, recognizing that, of course, trade has disrupted and technological advance goes with trade. I mean, that is the way you make progress. So setting up the rules for the trading economy, for the world economy for the 21st century is an opportunity that you'll have all the things you do, particularly in WTO. So the rectification process, which is in a way your own recognition that you are members of the founding members of, or you're not going to you're not going to be applied membership for the. The only thing now is that you will make it transparent that the schedules you have with the EU are yours, and of course there will be a negotiation, a decision, a accommodation of the UK as an independent member of WTO, but you are not new invitee to you should behave founding member at WTO and as a leading force transform WTO going forward. So the level of ambition that you give to your participation in WTO will determine how successful you are in all the ventures nationally, be them plurilateral. So don't see these four pillars soft. See them as complex, and multilateral one as basic foundation which will.
I think for a lot of people, the WTO process is a sort of black box that there's been quite confusing, to say the least, media coverage of the process. I think, Crawford, if we sort of walk through the process itself and what the UK is engaged in, because as Louis said, we are a member of the WTO. There's no question of accession or ratification. But the UK has already indicated that the way it will do that is through the common external tariff of the EU, that part of the services schedule of the EU. And then there are some issues agreeing our share of quotas with other countries and our share of agricultural support in the WTO. So talk a little bit about that, where you see the difficulties, where you see, it should be a relatively easier process. And then I think just talk to Luis's point about trade leadership and what the UK can accomplish. Having done those difficult things, then what can it do going forward?
Look, I mean, the way I look at it, I'm afraid is not going to be legalistic or technical. I know you'll be hugely disappointed at that. The way I look at it is the UK's been having a bit of a cup of tea in the WTO, having a bit of a snooze. I mean, for reasons that, there are its own reasons, it decided that for a lengthy period of time, it would have a bit of a sleep and let Brussels look after its interests in the GATT and the WTO. But it was always really there. It just had happened to have assigned a lot of its responsibilities on a day-to-day basis effectively to Brussels. Now, this is not a technically correct version, but I would argue it's what the political reality has been. And all of a sudden, the UK's woken up and said, well, actually don't want to delegate it anymore, want to take control of the whole thing ourselves and run our own shop. And we're a member of this organisation. We have been applying the rules, some of which we negotiated ourselves, some of which were drafted by the UK, literally. I mean, the creation of the GATT is principally a creation of the UK and the US in the post-war period. You can't wish all that away. That's the political reality. And look, there are going to be plenty of people who are highly paid and who are also inherently difficult personalities, and most of them are diplomats, I hasten to add, because that's what they're meant to do, create difficulties so that they can keep themselves employed. And they'll come up with 10,000 reasons why there's a technical difficulty over this and a technical difficulty over that. And that's fine, Shankar. And that kind of kabuki play will unfold in Geneva over the next 2 years among the poor and benighted people who enjoy those kind of games. And you may occasionally read the odd press story about how complicated that is, and that's fine. But none of that will detract from what I consider the basic political reality, which is quite simple, which is the UK has always been there, and it's still going to be there in a slightly different form in 2 years' time. And the second thing that is fundamental, and it's not complicated, is the only thing that actually matters in the basic political sense is that the rest of the membership can be assured that they will be essentially no worse off after this process has happened in 2 years' time than they are now. And what the next 2 years is about is a process that's partly political, partly technical, where the UK, which has already given this political assurance, as I understand it, to all its trading partners, basically makes it clear in technical terms how it's going to do that. And as an outsider, I can't see that as being fundamentally problematic. I mean, the world recognises effectively, although junior diplomats in Geneva may have difficulty coming to terms with it, I freely confess that. But at the most fundamental political level, the world understands that the fifth largest economy is not going to go rogue because it's become the United Kingdom with its own trade policy. It's going to behave in the post-Brexit period essentially at least as well as it behaved before, and it will provide the appropriate technical assurances to deliver on that guarantee. And that will be a lot of hard work for a lot of bureaucrats, but actually in the political sense, it's not fundamentally complicated. So that to me is how I see it. in a basic political way. But don't, in my view, and I'm an outsider in this process, don't think that that's actually the most important story. It is important to grasp that that is what is going on. It's actually not that complicated at the political level. The really more important story is essentially what the UK can now do. Because the UK will now, in that body, have an independent voice. It will now be able to be very clear about how it wants to shape the global priorities. And believe me, the World Trade Organization, the membership, the multilateral organization which governs international trading rules, it's fundamental to the stability of the international economy in a way that very few people really grasp because it's been lost in the technical detail. It provides the stability upon which the post-war economic miracle that has happened in East Asia occurred, for instance. That rests on the foundation of the WTO, but the WTO has plateaued. It's plateaued because it hasn't got the kind of leadership and innovative thinking that will take it to the next level. The UK now has a unique opportunity within the WTO, not to function in the WTO as some kind of Johnny-come-lately worried about the technical details of its schedules, but rather to provide economic leadership for the global trade agenda. And my God, doesn't the world need that right now? I mean, many of the leading economies in the world have lost the plot. A major economy in the form of China wants to make reform, but is politically unable to do so. An economy like the UK is going to be an independent and powerful voice for reform and change in the global economy. And that is going to be a massively refreshing political voice in Geneva. From what I hear, the UK government seems to be committed to that course in the future. And that is, in actual fact, the real story about what the WTO process means for the UK. It's rectification, but I have a different view of rectification. It's not some technical attempt to settle the accounts from the dinner that was enjoyed 2 or 3 weeks ago. It's about rectifying the sorry state of the international trade agenda by bringing it up to date and planning for the future.
And so, Alan, let's talk about services for a second, because obviously this economy is 80% services. So it's the fifth biggest economy in the world. It's a major. The need in the UK is for services liberalisation. If the UK doesn't get services liberalisation, lowering the tariff on shoes is not going to help. So in that context, and in this long view that Crawford kind of outlined, where we are going through a technical process that we have to go through, 2 questions. One, what are our WTO partners going to make of this? How are they going to respond to the opportunity to have a new chess piece on the sort of trade policy chessboard, and to be able to sort of ease that process for the UK so that all these good things that Crawford outlined can happen? And have a look back over the last 2 decades on services liberalisation in the WTO, and what might the next 2 decades lead to with the UK as a player.
Thank you, Shankar. You obviously know it's a favourite subject of mine, otherwise you wouldn't have asked me to do this. I'll say one other thing. It's very odd to sit in a large room and have people talk about WTO without the doors being bolted, because it is very arcane. When I was in Geneva many years ago, my wife used to detest our going to dinners to sit down and talk about things, because there'd be endless WTO speak among all the women, among all the men, and the women would be, well, there were some women who were negotiators as well, but all the spouses would be sit there looking out the window, waiting, hoping this discussion would end so they could go home. Part of the reason for that is the arcanery and depth of significance of the WTO. I'm going to come to service in a tick, but what's not actually appreciated, part of it is the WTO not marketing and selling itself very well. It is one of the few international agreements in the world which sets legally binding commitments which are adhered to, and there are penalties paid if not complied with. There are almost no global treaties which achieve this. To put it into nice contrast, the Paris Agreement on climate change is not an agreement at all. It's a decision of the members of the General Assembly, and there's no legal penalty for any member state not to comply. WTO is quite different. There are very significant penalties when countries do not follow the rules, and there's many cases where one party will take the other into that process. There'll be a legally binding obligation, and the parties have to comply to change the rules. If they don't, there can be extremely heavy fines put in place. There's very little international law like this. Now, Shankar mentioned services because patterns of world trade have actually changed quite significantly. Tariffs are quite low worldwide. WTO used to be all about countries harmonising their tariffs and providing guaranteed rights that partners could trade on the terms set. Tariffs, with the exception of agriculture, are quite low. Today, global growth depends upon opening up services markets. And for most countries, in fact, the output generated by services in the industrialised countries is actually larger than the output generated in production of goods. Now, the WTO pioneered the establishment of an international agreement to try to set up a similar system whereby countries could get the benefit of services. And they've got a certain distance, but it's stalled. We all know the WTO has now been bogged for about 10 or 12 years. And one of the areas in which agreement should have been made was to build up this framework to negotiate on services. There are only really simple rules at this stage. One of the problems is that WTO has 160 odd members. Frankly, there's only about 50 who make a contribution to world trade. You take those 50 countries will be the advanced developing countries and the developed countries. We have another 110 members who might contribute 1% of world trade. They've become something of a drag in the way the WTO works. On services, we needed the leadership of the major services economies, but being a member of the EU, the UK was obliged to take an EU position. And the EU is, in fact, the most liberal of all the members. The UK is the most liberal of all the EU countries in terms of having open services markets and generating wealth from trading services. And in today's world, that's where future growth lies. The challenge for developing countries is to open their services market. And that's what is needed. Now, for us sitting there, it became a very morose experience to have to sit and listen to the representative of the EU explain a common position representing the 20-odd members. And in that, those EU positions had to represent the common view of all the member states. The UK was the most liberal in services, but could not express its interests as the most liberal party because they had to coordinate the position with the other members of the EU. Now, what we look forward to, what we're so excited about, is seeing the UK reactivate itself as an independent member of the WTO, where it can take policy positions in its own national interest and not be bound by the position taken by the EU, and in fact lead for advanced discussions in this area where future growth is going to be very important. And that's services. Now, on services, I'll just say one thing. A lot of the debate about Brexit was the potential restriction on the ability of the UK to trade financial services. There was a great brouhaha about this. I was very curious to see what the share was and did some analysis, looked up the records to see what were the biggest services industries exported from the UK. Guess what? Not financial services. It's actually the engineering services, our bigger corporate services. They are more significant contributors to the UK economy than the financial sector. Now, this makes the UK the most significant leader in global services, and what we see as a wonderful opportunity is with the UK, once it's been able to establish itself once again as an independent member pursuing its own interests in the WTO and in other international negotiations, we'll be able to activate further discussion and opening of markets in services which will promote growth in the future. We think that's a very exciting opportunity.
So this is very much a two-step process. There's a rectification over the course of the next 2 years to ensure that the UK is fully has its wings, as it were, as a full member of the WTO, and then take advantage of that over the next period to deepen liberalisation in its own interest. Now, in that 2-year process, I'll ask one question of Crawford as the former agriculture chairman. There are agricultural issues. They will, over the next 2 years, hit the news in terms of our shares of quotas with the European Union. How much this 2-year process of WTO rectification is happening at the same time as the Article 50 process with the European Union. Collaboration and cooperation with the European Union in the WTO as we go through that process is going to be quite important. How do you see that panning out? What should be the UK's approach to the EU in the WTO as distinct from our approach to the EU in the withdrawal negotiations?
Well, I think the basic position, as I understand it, for the UK government, which is that it's looking to have a full free trade agreement with the EU, would be applicable in agriculture in the same way as any other product. So, on the assumption that the UK succeeds in having a full free trade agreement or a transitional approach to a free trade agreement in the post Article 50 process, that's something which the WTO acknowledges because it's a free trade agreement, and provided it's successfully concluded, that won't get in the way of what technically the UK has to do with its other trading partners outside the EU. And for the rest of those trading partners outside the EU, you've mentioned that agriculture will be perhaps one of the most difficult things to settle. That's a matter at the political level, I would say, of dividing up what are the most restricted parts of the current EU external structure, market access that it provides for agriculture, and they go by the hideous name of tariff quotas. And here we're wandering into what Alan talks about that makes people's eyes close. But I mean, essentially it means that there are quantitative limits on the amount of imports that are allowed into the EU as a whole. So the UK's come out of, or will come out of that arrangement. So there's a dividing up that will have to take place. If you allow 100,000 tonnes of a product into the whole EU, you have to figure out how much of that tariff quota of 100,000 belongs to the EU 27 and how much belongs to the UK. So you have parallel discussions with the UK and the EU to have a view on that, and the trading partners will have a view on that. And I would be pretty confident in saying at some point within the 2-year period, I would say it'll be 6 to 12 months down the track, the UK will say, we believe that we owe the rest of the world 20,000 tonnes. And the rest of the world will say, oh, no, we owe you, you owe us 50,000 tonnes. And they will sit down and they'll have a negotiation, which will last a short period of time. And they will roughly come to a Solomonic decision about what an appropriate level is. And because the UK is quite clear that it does not want anybody outside the EU to suffer loss, I'm absolutely certain that that political message will be carried forward to a technical level, and after negotiations, the rest of the world countries will get what they consider to be a roughly reasonable access to the UK, which reflects how much of their historical trade went to the UK. What the UK can't deliver on is what Brussels delivers for those other third countries, and that's Brussels' problem, not the UK's problem. And the other trading partners will have to knock on the doors in Brussels to make sure that their interests in the EU 27 are taken care of. Now, I'm not saying that the EU 27 will have a different philosophical approach to the UK. I think at the end of the day, they'll probably have pretty much the same approach. So I'm among the group that thinks that it will be very unlikely that that process will break down or will deliver a poor result. I don't think it's actually that complicated. For 2 or 3 products, at the end of the day, there'll be a horse trading exercise, but there always is, and I'm pretty sure that they will not be deal breakers for the whole exercise.
Yeah. The danger for the EU in this process is that they will, by potentially changing the access of third countries, they will potentially be at risk themselves, which is more likely to lead to cooperation from them.
Well, yeah, that may well be the case, and they'll have to make their own decisions about how they want to handle that with their other trading partners, and they'll have to have discussions with the UK about it as well. But it's not necessary that there's formal agreement between London and Brussels about how that happens. You can technically do it independently in separate silos, but my guess is that once the initial jockeying is over, there'll be an informal process where everybody roughly accommodates the outcome. But you're not talking a large number of products for market access there. You're mainly talking livestock products. But what will affect it, and I should be very clear about that, what will affect that, and that's some way down the path, is whether or not there is a genuine free trade agreement negotiated between the UK and the EU27. Because if the UK and the EU decide, for whatever reason, that they're unable to do that, then you have a much more complicated life for both the EU27 and the UK, which is, well, if we don't have this bilateral arrangement between the two of us, we'll have to transport that into the WTO and have a WTO relationship for that. Now, my view is that eventually, it may well be that internally people are already there. Eventually, they will say, it will be one of the reasons why they will say, yeah, it makes so much sense to have a genuine bilateral agreement, because it's a much simpler way to manage EU27 trade with the UK and UK trade with the 27. And it's in neither party's interest to deal with that at a multilateral WTO level than it is to deal with it bilaterally. So, you know, I'm not involved in these negotiations anymore. I'm just a retired academic. But looking at it as a retired academic from the outside, I would say all the evidence points to me that sane and rational people will see that as an additional reason why they sort out their family problems among themselves before they deal with the wider world outside.
Thank you very much. Unfortunately, we are short of time, and so we're going to go straight into the next panel, which is on prospects of a North Atlantic and other free trade agreements.